Hello and welcome to the Malika Writes channel. My name is Malika Writes, and today we are going to be doing part 2 of the Dangers of the Fae World series. Now, I was struggling a little bit with how to frame this next video because I really wanted the point to come across. Then someone in my comment section for the first video commented that so the Fae World is basically a combination of heaven and hell. And no, it's not. But that really did give me a way to frame this next video. And I hope that you guys enjoy it. So basically, this video is going to almost answer that question and then expand on this concept of the Fae world. So heaven and hell are two very specific concepts. So yes, they get thrown, these words, heaven and hell, get thrown around so much in popular culture that we think anything blissful and good is heaven and anything just bad and horrific is hell. But that's the secularist understanding of it, and it's not a very helpful understanding because then you almost use it to make this sort of comparison and it doesn't really fit. So in order to really expatiate on this point, I really want to get the concepts of heaven and hell right, so that you can understand why the Fae world is not a combination of the two. So heaven is a very specific concept which is attached to the Christian doctrine. It's not nirvana, it's not paradise in the Muslim tradition. It's a very specific sort of thing in the Christian doctrine. And heaven, the purpose of heaven is to be the throne of God. It's to be the dwelling place of the angels. It's to be the dwelling place of the dead, where they will dwell with God until the end of days, when heaven and earth shall be reunited and there shall be a reign forevermore of God. That's the basic, simplified but accurate concept of heaven. Now, hell is basically the place where people who don't want to be with God, everything that doesn't want to be with God goes there. And it is absent of God. That's hell. So heaven is in the presence of God and hell is absent of the presence of God. And that's the difference between the two. So you can see now that those are very specific concepts to a particular religion. And so when you take it out of that religion and use the words to sort of try and describe the Fae world, it doesn't work. Mainly because the Fae world is not a place. It can be confusing because I've used this word world to attach to it. But like I said in the first video, the Fae world is the collective dream of humanity. It is sort of a collective imagination. So it's not a physical place like the concepts of hell and heaven allude to. Those are said to be physical places, whereas the Fae world is an imagination space. It's sort of, imagine it like a cloud. It's there because we have a collective imagination, which is something that Joseph Campbell talked about a lot. We have a collective imagination, and that is what we associate with the Fae world. But it's not a physical place. When I talked about portals to access the Fae world, that might also bring to mind, well, how can you access something that's not a place? But because it's a product of a collective, you don't own it solely. So you have access to it because you are not the sole owner of this thing. So that being said, can you sort of see that the Fae world, heaven and hell, they don't match together? I understand what the comment was trying to say, but it's not an accurate way to sort of and conceptualize it. And if you conceptualize it as a combination of those two, it really jacks up what the Fae world is. Another reason why the comparison doesn't really work is because the Fae world isn't something that it's got like a good or evil concept. So the Fae world it's not devoid of morality because human beings innately have a moral compass, but it doesn't have the religious connotations that heaven and hell have, because it's not bound up by a particular religious doctrine. It's just basically the collective imagination of people. So it contains elements of everything. But heaven and hell have a specific doctrine that they are attached to, and therefore they are a lot more binary than the Feywild. The Feywild is a lot more fluid. It's ever changing. It's basically a cloud. Also, when we talk about combining heaven and hell, those two things inherently cannot be combined, hence the binary, which is why the Feywild being a combination of the two wouldn't make sense. And that brings us sort of into the danger of the Feywild, specifically because it has no sort of governing rule about it other than the innate morality of human beings. Because it's mostly flexible, it opens up the person who accesses it to a world where anything is possible. Your imagination can make literally anything happen within the realm of the Feywild. So that is another reason why the binary attachment doesn't work, because the Feywild is without binaries. Without it is without explicit restriction. There are obviously restrictions because the human imagination, while we say it is unrestricted, but it is in some ways restricted because we tend to just recycle things over and over. But restrictions as we think of them, as in there is no rule saying you can't do that within the Feywild. So that is the appeal of the Feywild. It's the fact that it's so free and basically anything can happen within it. Then when you contrast that with our world, where there are binaries, where there are restrictions, where there are rules, you can't just come up with an idea and have it work within this world, because we live in a tangible world. That is the tension between the Feywild, or the collective imagination, and the real world, which is tangible and has rules, and things don't just happen for no reason or because you will it to. There are actual trade-offs. There are things that you have to do. There are rules that you have to play by. There are powers greater than you. So that's why escapism into the Feywild or into the collective imagination is so appealing. Where this world has its rules and things that restrict you, and the Feywild basically has, the only restriction is how much you can think. So in that sense, you can see where the tension comes in. Now, when we look at Berserk, we can see an example of this Feywild. Berserk is a manga that I love a lot, just because I think it's not afraid to actually have consequences. A lot of animes, a lot of stories in general are afraid to actually have consequences for actions. For example, Harry Potter, which was very great for me growing up, when I read it as an adult, I kind of see not the flaws, because it's not like the writing is not perfect, obviously, but it's not like the writing is now atrocious now that I'm an adult, but there are very little consequences to actions. People just do things, and so long as we're given an explanation that to a child seems reasonable, it goes untouched. Voldemort is supposed to be this very powerful wizard who literally split his soul into 7 pieces, and yet a 17-year-old can beat him. And that's not even talking about the other times that Harry beat him as he grew up. So there are very little consequences, and it's that way because it's a children's book. It's not meant for adults, it's meant for children. But it's a typical example of the Feywild. Harry literally escapes from his life as a muggle child into this world where anything is possible. But the rules of magic are not hard at all. They're not set in stone. They're just sort of made up as J.K. Rowling's went along. And that actually caused a little bit of trouble moving forward with the story after the Harry Potter series ended, because then now the rules were sort of loose and nobody really knew what the fundamentals were, and they had to sort of make things up as you go along. But what I love about Berserk is the fact that the rules of the world, the law of causality, which is a major factor in Berserk, is one of the things that is very real about our world. If you do something, there will be an effect. So there will be an effect, and that will come back to haunt you, essentially. So that is one of the things I loved about Berserk. But bringing it to this example, Berserk is the story about a man who is basically at war with a horde of demons after he is branded by his former best friend during an event called the Eclipse. That is the very, very sort of ultra summarized version, because I don't want to give too much away. This is definitely one of the stories I recommend reading if you haven't read it before, because it's absolutely great. But Berserk, Guts, who's the main character of Berserk, has to constantly contend with these demons after he is branded, because the brand attracts demons to him, especially at night. So that is sort of Guts's main, and that's the main villain that he sort of has to fight. However, there is also the consequences, the lasting consequences of the eclipse, which is that Guts had to watch the love of his life be viciously assaulted in front of him. And as a result of that, she is left mentally deficient and disabled. And that's a very real consequence. That's a tangible thing. That's something that could happen in our world. So it's a very tangible, very real thing. It's not something he can fight with his fists. And that's the tension. Because if Guts had not been branded, the demons wouldn't have been such a reality in his life. And the demons and the brand puts Guts in something called the interstice. And the interstice is the place where he can interact directly with these demons. And so we can see this as the Feywild and the real world merging. But Casca's mental disability, even though it was caused by the real world and the Feywild mingling during the eclipse, but the consequence of it, her very real disability, is what we can put in the tangible world. So and what Guts does is that instead of staying with Casca and sort of looking after her and sort of trying to find a new way to navigate life, Guts gives himself over to revenge, and he goes after the demons to hunt them down and to kill them and fully immerse himself in the Feywild, which is fighting demons. Anything is possible, the extraordinary is possible, and that's what Guts does. Now, to us reading the story, that's great. We love seeing all the gore. We love seeing everything that is going on. It's exciting. It makes for a really good read. However, there's this tension in the text. And Miura, the writer, who unfortunately has passed away, but he was very aware of this and actually does explore this. So I want to specifically latch onto an arc called Conviction. And just as this arc is sort of kicking off, we have a mini arc called Lost Children. Now, Lost Children is where we sort of see Guts lose his humanity a bit. So after chasing these demons for what has been at this point 2 years, Guts enters what we call the Conviction arc. And Lost Children is Guts sort of going into this village, and he's fighting demons as usual. But in this village, there's the main antagonist is this girl who wanted to be a fairy so bad that she becomes a demon who takes the shape of this sort of fairy-like creature. She steals children from the local villages and turns them into these demonic fairy-looking creatures that are more similar to wasps than they are to actual fairies. So that's her deal. And they eat people, livestock. They literally ruin everything. They are not nice at all. If you read the manga to see how demonic these things are. And so Guts is bulldozing his way through Midland, which is the place that we are, which is the land, the overall landscape that we are in Berserk. And so everywhere Guts goes, he's not a heroic figure. Everywhere he goes, he leaves carnage and just chaos in his wake. In this little town that he goes through, it seems like, you know, the normal monster of the week sort of fight. But the thing about this is that the children who have been turned into these demonic little elf wasp creatures didn't have a choice. They weren't given a choice. They were kidnapped and forcefully turned into these things by this demon lady who was a little girl who really just wanted to live a paradise away from her vicious life, which was very difficult because she was abused by her family. But she has caused so much pain and suffering by kidnapping these kids and forcefully turning them into elves for her own pleasure. And now that they're demonic creatures, they're really just acting demonic. But when Guts kills a demon, they revert back to their human form. So as Guts kills these demon elf things, they turn back into human children. And so Guts isn't really looking like the hero in this instance. I mean, he really hasn't been. Every town he's gone through, he's left in utter carnage. So he's not a heroic figure, even though he is our protagonist, but he's not supposed to look like a hero. He's not even going into these towns to rescue people. He's going in for his own vendetta. So what makes this particular fight, this mini arc, so significant is the fact that Guts really loses control here. He slaughters these demon kids. Yeah, they're really demonic, but the way he does it, we have a lot of panels where we see Guts's face turn into something not quite human. We see lots of panels where our main narrator, Jill, is sort of more scared of Guts than she is of the actual demons. So we have a lot of contrast between Guts as a sort of a human figure, but then he's also looking a lot more menacing than the demons. And when we know the main villain's backstory, it makes the lines between good and evil a lot more blurred. And we don't really know where Guts sits in all of this. He's not strictly a hero because we know his motivations. We see the way he acts towards the characters. And we also see him when he's really losing it and working off crazy person logic. But we also know that he's doing this because he's lost a lot. He's really suffered. So we sympathize with him, and I don't think it would be fair to call him a villain, but we do see that the actual consequence of him chasing after these demons is the fact that he is losing his humanity. And I don't think anybody can argue with that, because this arc is where we first are introduced to the Beast of Darkness, which is the culmination of all Guts' anger and revenge literally coming to possess him. It's not an actual demon, it is Guts' own darkness. And that is as a direct consequence of him chasing the Feywild. He's not getting closer to his goal of taking revenge on the friend that betrayed him during the eclipse. He's actually just fighting monsters for 2 years non-stop. But he's not actually getting closer to his goal. Instead, he's just killing and killing and killing. And after he manages to kill the main villain in the Lost Children arc, he is walking through the forest, and the demons that are still around during the daytime are mocking him, telling him about the children, and we see the Beast of Darkness for the first time. So we really start to explore this idea, and it leads nicely into the rest of the conviction arc, which is where Guts decides to come off this road of revenge and to actually fight, not just for the sake of revenge, but fight to save someone. That someone being Casca. This is where Guts comes back to the real world and where his struggle actually begins. It's relatively easy for Guts to remain in the Feywild and deal with these demonic creatures and take out his hate and reduce himself to a monster in order to take on monsters. But to keep his humanity in order to be present for the people that need him and defend them from these creatures takes a lot more out of Guts than anything. And that is what the whole Millennium of the Falcon War arc is about, just a final long stretch arc of Berserk. And it's absolutely amazing. But there we see Guts struggle the most, because he can't just become a monster. He can't let go of his humanity. He has to remain composed because Casca needs him. And we actually see what happens when Guts temporarily slips into the beast. He temporarily lets the Beast of Darkness sort of take over. And it actually sets him back a lot with Casca and makes her distrust him, which hurts him the most. But that's Guts tackling the real world. It takes so much more out of him than anything he ever faced in the Feywild. So, bringing us back to the dangers of the Feywild, while in your imagination you may be conquering something, you may be going through so much adversity, but the real world will always be more difficult. Hence the temptation to run away to the Feywild. And that is inherently the danger of it. Because as you leave the real world to crumble, your life will crumble because you exist in the tangible world. You don't exist in that world. So when you forsake the real world to go off chasing a dream, and this is not your purpose. I'm not talking about chasing your purpose, because your purpose is tied up in the tangible world. It's not in the Feywild. It's tied up in the real and the now and the present. But when you go off chasing your imagination or living in a daydream, this tangible world crumbles. The things you love suffer. The people you love suffer. And that's the danger of the Feywild. And that is why I really wanted to frame this video properly, so that you could really understand what the Feywild is, what it isn't, and the real danger of it, by using an anime that I think really does a good job. In the manga Berserk, we have a character called Godo, and he is a blacksmith that deals with Guts' sword and his armor and stuff. And he really brings this argument that I'm trying to give to the forefront, because he basically lays it all out for Guts. Guts didn't go off to save other people from the demons that ruined his life. He ran away from Casca. He ran away from the very real reality of having to deal with the fact that the woman he loved was basically a husk of a former self, which was real and tangible and actually existed in the real world. He went off chasing things, chasing adventure, chasing monsters and demons and killing things in the Feywild, while the very real world around him was crumbling. Guts isn't even aware of the Kushan army's takeover. That's how out of it he is. Things are happening in the real world that Guts isn't even aware of, because he's so busy in the Feywild chasing these demons. And that's not to say that the moment Guts comes back to the real world that the demons disappear. Of course not. The whole story is about Guts from that point, from the point after the conviction arc is basically Guts protecting Casca from the demons that are still chasing them. But the difference is that he has a goal. When he's protecting Casca, they are going towards Elvenhelm so that they can possibly heal her of her mental disability. And so they have a goal that they're getting towards. He's protecting her. The demons now act as obstacles in the way of that goal. Now the story turns into a quest. It turns more into something that is tangible. Because as you're going somewhere, when you have a goal along your road, you will have obstacles. Rather than going off and slaying demons, now the demons almost act as the thing that will grow Guts and really sober him up. Because fighting these demons and having to protect Casca at the same time shows Guts the value of his humanity, because if he lets go of that, he actually becomes a danger to the people he loves. And so that becomes a growth process. Whereas when Guts was in the Feywild, he was actually devolving. So there is a huge difference between the two roads. And that's kind of the danger of it. You can pull inspiration from the Feywild. You can imagine that human beings fly. And then in the tangible world, you create a device that allows that to happen. But if you stay in that world, in the Feywild, in the imagination, you will never actually come down to reality. You will never actually be able to create something lasting that is tangible here. And a lot of times we run away from the real because it's a lot more painful to deal with what is in the real world than to deal with what is in the Feywild, because that's your imagination. That always works out. You are always the hero in the Feywild. But in the real world, there is a real possibility of failure. There is a real possibility that even if you achieve your goal, it will not be perfect. And that is what we see in Berserk. And I really don't want to spoil so much, but for the sake of this video, major spoiler. Even when the goal is achieved in Elvenhelm, it is not perfect because Casca still feels immense pain around Guts. So they still can't even be together in the way that they want to. So there's a lot of pain all around, and that is a reality of the real world. Whereas in the Feywild, you can snap your fingers and things will go back to the way that they were. Anything can happen in that world. You can read a story and happy ever after can be a thing. But in the real world, in the tangible world, sometimes it doesn't work. And if you want it to work, the sacrifice of what you have to give in order to make something work in the tangible world sometimes makes you question the value of the goal. And that's just the reality of life. But running away from that, the consequences of running from the tangible world are so much more devastating than anything you can do. And so it is advisable that despite the sorrow that may be involved, it's advisable to continue to struggle in the real world than to lose yourself in the imagination of the Feywild. So thank you for watching this video. I hope that you have enjoyed it. I hope that this concept is now clearer to you. If you have any more questions, please let me know. I am always happy to expand on this, but I hope that this video has been somewhat conclusive for you. So thank you very much for watching. This has been the Malika Writes channel.